So I just want to re-emphasize the goals of this course. Okay, so basically my goal is to introduce some of the interesting ideas of topology in the simplest way possible, using as few technical terms as possible, and basically I want to show you the fun stuff. I want to show you the interesting puzzles, the interesting shapes, the sort of curiosities, without going into the deep theorems and details and so on. So why am I doing this? Well, mostly I'm doing this so that people who haven't had the benefits of doing an undergraduate degree in maths, maybe because they're too young or maybe because they just didn't do a degree in maths, I want those kind of people to have access to some of the really wonderful things in topology, some of the really interesting things, because I think that they're very easy for anybody to appreciate. In fact, I think they're very easy for quite a lot of new people to contribute to. For example, quite a few blind people have been able to prove some amazing results about topology. And that's probably because they are blind. Like, being blind gives them a different kind of view of topology and allows them to see things that other people can't. On the other hand, I read a paper about somebody who was doing glass blowing, and this man was a professional glass blower who was also interested in topology, and he was able to use his glass blowing skills to blow up some certain glasses and produce some certain kinds of manifolds. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that topology is a new discipline. It's very much under development, and if you're a young kid, maybe you're like a 13-year-old watching this, you've certainly got the capacity to invent some things that nobody has ever thought of before. And on the other hand, if you are a professional mathematician, then maybe you might find this course a little bit too low level, or maybe you might find it interesting as a kind of relaxation thing, because I am going to show some quite novel things which don't normally appear in the standard textbooks, but on the other hand I'm not going to give rigorous arguments and so on. Okay, so what I want to start talking about is some of the simplest things in topology. Let's talk about some surfaces. So, what's the simplest kind of surface you can think of? Well, probably the plane, right? A two-dimensional thing. You can, a piece of paper would be an example of a limited plane. Now, in mathematics we sometimes think about a plane that goes on forever in each direction, but let's just talk about this plane to start with. And remember that, so let's just talk about this piece of paper, and remember that in topology we're allowed to make continuous deformations, okay? And so we should sort of imagine that this thing is made out of rubber, and what that means is that we can kind of deform this paper however we want, except that we can't change the fact that it's 2D, and we're not allowed to tear it or glue parts of it together. So maybe it's better to imagine that this is made out of something like blue tack. Okay, so let's make a blue tack representation of such a thing. Okay, well, so here's my blue tack representation of this rectangle. Now, the reason I want to use blue tack is because I want to show you that we're allowed to do deformations. So, for example, we'd be allowed to deform this and to change it into a circle. I mean, in topology, things like corners and angles are quite irrelevant usually. Because we're allowed to do continuous deformations, we're allowed to smooth things out. So that's kind of nice, because normally in geometry you have to think about all kinds of complicated things like angles and lengths and all the rest of it, whereas in topology you kind of only look at the really interesting stuff, kind of like how things are connected together. That's one of the things I like about topology. It really cuts to the heart of some of the mysteries that you find in mathematics. Anyway, so we can essentially view this as being sort of equivalent to this topologically. And so essentially we'll call both of these disks. These are two-dimensional disks. Now if you imagine that you're a little man who's walking around on this disk, say you're this little two-dimensional creature here, and you're walking around on this disk, you're going to notice some differences. Okay, so when you're here, it's going to look pretty similar to when you're here, or to when you're here, but when you get to the edge, you're going to notice something a bit funny, right? Like people in medieval times fantasized about the idea of falling off the edge of the earth because they thought the earth was flat. Well, this two-dimensional creature, if this was their world, they might think of something similar to this. They would feel very strange when they get to this point, because they'd see the end of their surface that they live on. So you can contrast that to something like a sphere. I mean, if you imagine that you're a little two-dimensional being living on a sphere, wherever you go on the sphere, you're never ever going to reach a kind of boundary point. And so that means there's a kind of fundamental difference between these two surfaces. Basically, in this kind of surface, not every single point is similar, because some points on the boundary don't look the same locally, whereas here every point looks the same locally, and this is a topological kind of thing. Okay then, so now I want to introduce some new kinds of surfaces. Firstly though, let me explain the kind of connection between the disk and the sphere. How are these two objects related? Well, a good idea is to think about the cube. Okay, so let's see if I can make a cube out of this paper. I think we've all seen it before, how one can fold up a piece of paper to make something like a cube. So we can get our original disk and we can kind of deform it a little bit, and we can change it into something like this. I mean, topologically it's still a disk, we've just bent it a little bit and deformed it slightly, but we haven't really changed anything topologically. But hopefully now you can see that if we take another disk, which is shaped like this, then if we attach these two disks together in the proper way, we're going to get a cube. And topologically speaking, this is going to be equivalent to a sphere. So in our view then, what this means is that we can make a sphere just by attaching together two different disks. So that's quite a nice way to think about what a sphere is. Well, okay then, so let's talk about some more different kinds of surfaces. So now I'm going to show you about cylinders. So there's a pretty simple way to make a cylinder starting from a rectangle. Basically, you can probably think about how to do it. You just take the two opposite sides and you just glue them together, and then you get something like a cylinder. So let's do this. Now, there's even a certain amount of intrigue in such a simple thing as a cylinder. I mean, you can see, for example, that if you're a little two-dimensional creature, you could travel round and round it in this way for as long as you wanted. But if you walked off in this direction, you would reach the boundary and maybe fall off the end of this world. another quite interesting thing to think about is to think about the kind of one-dimensional spaces. So far we've been talking about surfaces. They're two-dimensional spaces because you can go horizontally and vertically. But what about one-dimensional spaces? What kind of one-dimensional spaces do we have? Well, basically we've just got two. We've just got the line and we've got the circle. Okay? These are the only two really sort of fundamental one-dimensional spaces you can have. Now there are some caveats here, but I'm not gonna go into them. But it's interesting now to think about the cylinder, because we can see the circle appearing if we look at the cylinder this way, and we can see the line appearing if we see the cylinder this way. So one way you can think of the cylinder is as a load of lines, like up here, up here, up here, up here, all arranged round in a circle. Okay then, so now I'm going to get on to one of my all-time favourite kinds of shapes, the Mobius Band. This is something I've been looking forward to show you for the whole video, because it really is a wonderful shape in my opinion. I remember when I was about 11 years old, and my brother showed me the Mobius Band, and he showed me this, well, the things I'm about to show you, and I think something there really sort of sparked my imagination, and I often kept thinking back to that, and I think maybe that's one of the reasons I ended up becoming a mathematician. I think that there's a certain odd kind of mystery in the Mobius Band, because it's so simple, so kind of mysterious in other ways. So how do we make a Mobius Band? Well, basically we take a rectangle and we make half a twist to it. You can see that, right? So this side's opposite way around to this side, and then we're going to glue these sides together. So the construction is very similar to the cylinder. It's just that we make a half twist. So I'd like you to spend some time thinking about this object. In fact, I think it'd be really helpful if you stop this video now and actually make one of these things for yourself. It doesn't take much effort, but actually having this object physically in front of you is going to help you a lot in trying to get your head around what's going on here. Alright then, so here we have our Mobius Band. So take a good look at it. Take a good look at what this shape looks like. It's a pretty funny looking thing, and there's a good reason for that. It's because this thing has some very odd topological properties. It's the kind of thing, when you first see it, you find it kind of hard to even accept that it exists. So I think one of the best ways to start to get your head around this shape is to take a pen and then start drawing around the outside of the Mobius strip. So I shall try and do this so that you can see with the camera. Let's get it aligned. There we are. Well, I shall just do it for myself. I'll show later. So you see I'm drawing this line. I started off here. I've got along here. So far I've got this far. Okay. Now there's something interesting here. Right, so I continue this line just a little bit further. And now something quite strange has happened. So this is my progress so far, okay? This is the end of the line for me. So I'll put a little E here. This is the end of the line. Okay. So where did I start drawing this line from? Well, I started drawing the line over here. So let's put a little S where I started. So look at this. This S, this is where I started drawing the line, and this E here, this is where I've ended up, where the lines ended up so far. So what just happened was that I was drawing this line continuously across the surface, and I've ended up, if you like, although people don't like to say it like this, but one way you could think of it is that now this line is on the opposite side of the paper. So how does this happen? That's a good question. But let's just carry on drawing our line, okay? So we'll carry on from this E, and we'll just keep going. We'll see what happens. See if you can guess what happened when I just keep drawing this line. Well, here, what you can see is that we're actually coming back to where we started. So this is something quite amazing. We've actually been able to draw a line which goes across all of the surface of the Mobius strip, on the inside and the outside. So what does this mean? Well, what it means, essentially, is that this shape only has one side. That's something quite unfamiliar, right? I mean, a disc has two sides. It's got a front and it's got a back. But this shape only has one side. Okay, so the fact that this Mobius strip only has one side is one of its really quite strange topological properties. And here's another property which is really very, very odd in my opinion. And it's easy to see if you actually have a physical model. Okay, get your finger. So let's choose a good place to start. I'll start where this yellow tape is here. Okay, so you get your finger and just run it in the same direction along the top of the paper and see what happens. And you see now so I started off here and I'm actually here now, and I'm going in this direction. If I carry on, I end up back where I started. So what this means is that this shape only has one outer edge. That's quite a confusing idea as well. Basically it means that in some sense the boundary of this shape is a circle. So let's compare this to a cylinder. Okay, so here's a cylinder and here's a Mobius band. They're really quite similar. It's just that to get a Mobius band you do a half twist before you identify the ends of the rectangle. Okay, but they're quite different in some other ways. For example, this cylinder here, the boundary of this, it's got a circle up here and a circle down here, whereas the Mobius strip, its boundary is just one circle. See, that's something kind of interesting. Now, you might be thinking at this point, if you're a professional mathematician, you might be thinking, oh, you know, this is obvious, I've known this for ages, what else is new? But I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to tell you some things about the Mobius band which, even if you're a professional mathematician, you might not have seen before, because it turns out that the Mobius band actually has a very large amount of theory behind it, because it's actually related. It's kind of like the fundamental place in mathematics where a concept called non-orientability enters into the show. So there's some very interesting ways to represent the Mobius band, and there's some very interesting ways to use it. So there's another trick, a very, very interesting trick in my opinion. You can probably use this to surprise your friends, okay? Basically, you see this blue line that I just drew? I'm going to cut along that blue line, and something's going to happen to this shape, okay? I'm cutting around in a loop, and it's going to change the shape somehow. So my question to you is, what is this shape going to look like once I cut all the way around this blue line here? And I encourage you to pause this video, maybe make one of these for yourself, and to try and think about this for a while. I think if you haven't been exposed to this material before, it's probably quite a challenging problem to actually guess what's going to happen. It certainly surprised me when I first saw it. Anyway, let's go. Start cutting along this line here. Okay, so here we are. We're just about to reach the end. It's a good place to stop. You see, we just have a tiny little bit more cutting to do, and it's going to break, or something's going to break. So you can see that we've still got our Mobius band, but what's going to happen when we finish this cutting here? Well, let's do it. Let's just tear it. Okay. Alakazam. You're probably expecting this thing to break in two. That's what usually happens when you cut a loop around something. Something falls off. But that didn't happen in the case of the Mobius band. So when we cut the Mobius band around that loop, we get this funny looking thing. So what is this? Is it another Mobius band? No, it's not another Mobius band. Let's try and figure out what it is. Maybe if I stretch it out like this, it might be clear. Let's move it away from the camera. So it's actually I think it has. Does it have one full twist? Yes, it has one. It has one full twist. It's the same thing you get if you get a piece of paper, and instead of giving it half a twist, you give it a complete twist and then glue it together. You get one of these. So we've shown something that's kind of interesting from a higher perspective. We've essentially shown that there's something fundamentally different between the Mobius band and the cylinder. Okay? Because in the cylinder, if we draw any kind of loop, if we cut round it, it's going to fall apart. Okay? Even if we draw this loop, a loop like this, even if we draw a loop that goes all the way around the cylinder, if we cut along that loop, then the cylinder breaks in two. So there's a fundamental difference between the Mobius band and the cylinder, in the sense that the Mobius band has this property that you can cut around a loop without actually breaking the surface in two, and that's a topological property. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to make yet another surface. This is another kind of different type of surface called a torus. There were some toruses, or tori I suppose, in the previous video which I showed you. So I'm going to show you now how to make a torus out of paper. The basic idea is that you get your rectangle and you stick two opposite sides together. You kind of roll them over to make a cylinder shape. And now you basically do the same thing again with this side and this side. You basically stick these two sides together. So you can twist around your thing. It helps if you've got an absolutely massive piece of paper. Anyway, you can imagine you stick these two things together and you get something like a torus. It's actually a lot easier to make a torus out of something like blue tack. Okay, you can just sort of roll it up into a kind of sausage shape, and then you can just stick the two sides together and you have something like a torus. So a torus is another one of these kind of special surfaces which doesn't have a boundary. I mean, once again, imagine you're this little one-dimensional creature here walking around on the torus. No matter where you go, you're never going to get to the end of the shape. In this regard, it's a little bit like the sphere. Every part of it kind of looks the same because you can never reach the boundary point. Well, okay then, so let's talk about some topological properties of the plane. This is one of the fundamental properties of the plane. And it's quite a simple idea. Basically, the idea is just that if you draw any closed loop, so if you draw any simple closed loop like that, say, if you cut around that loop, it's going to separate the space into two pieces. In other words, every closed loop, everything that's topologically equivalent to a circle that you could draw in this surface, is going to split the surface into an inside and an outside. Okay? And so this is actually a really fundamental property of the plane, and not all surfaces have that kind of property. So for example, if you have a look at this ball, well, actually the ball still does have that property. If you draw a circle on the ball, it's going to separate the ball. There's going to be an inside of that curve and an outside. If you draw a circle around the equator, it's kind of difficult to see which is the inside and which is the outside, but still the sphere does have the same property like the plane, that any closed curve separates the object. So let me show you what I mean a bit more dramatically. This is the cube. As I say, it's essentially topologically equivalent to a sphere. So if we draw a closed curve like this, obviously if we cut around this, it's going to separate the surface into two pieces, actually two discs. And hopefully you can see that even if we draw a curve like this, one of these kind of great circles that goes all the way around the outside, if we cut around this curve, it's still going to separate the thing into two. And so that's one of the fundamental properties that the plane and the sphere both have. Okay, and so a good way to make a torus is to get some kind of sausage shape like this, and then to stick the two ends together. So we get our kind of torus shape. So an interesting question then is, what are the fundamental differences between a torus and a sphere? Well, obviously a torus has a hole in it, right? And a sphere doesn't have a hole in it. And like I was saying in my last video, whatever you do to the sphere, you can't put a hole in it. And whatever continuous deformation you do to the torus, you can't get rid of a hole. But let's think about a more interesting question. Imagine you were a little two-dimensional creature. Where's our two-dimensional creature gone? Here he is. Okay. Imagine you're this little two-dimensional creature and you're walking around on your two-dimensional world, and you want to figure out what kind of world this is. Actually, it's kind of interesting to think about this question scaled up. Is it possible that our three-dimensional world might be some kind of crazy shape? We don't actually know. But anyway, let's think about this two-dimensional case. So you're this little 2D creature walking around, and how do you know if you're on a sphere? Well, one way that you can figure out if you're on a sphere is just keep walking in the same direction, and if you get back where you're starting from, you know you're not on the plane, okay? On a finite disk, because on a finite disk you would reach a boundary. But that kind of trick won't tell you the difference between a torus and a sphere, because the torus also has this property that if you keep walking around the torus, you can get back to where you started from. So how do you differentiate between these two objects? Well, like I was saying, the sphere has this special property that if you draw a closed loop, it's always going to separate the space into an inside and an outside. But the torus actually doesn't have that property necessarily, because it's actually possible on the torus that you can draw a closed loop which doesn't separate the space into an inside and an outside. And this is a kind of fundamental difference between this shape and this shape. So let me show you what I mean. Basically, I'm not going to draw on it with a pen because I don't want to mess up this blue tack. I'll just use this paper to illustrate. So imagine we make this loop here, okay? Imagine we draw this loop around here. You see, this loop doesn't actually separate the space into an inside and an outside. And so this is a special property of the torus. I mean, with the sphere, the cube or whatever, if you cut around any closed loop, you always separate the surface into two different pieces. But for the torus, you can find these closed loops, like this one here, and if you cut around them, you don't actually break the surface into two pieces. In this case, you turn the surface into a cylinder. And now, of course, if we cut the surface again, we are going to split the surface into two pieces. Alright then, so far I've showed you quite a lot of surfaces which, if you've never been exposed to topology before, should be kind of interesting to you. And if you have been exposed to topology before, you'd probably be thinking, okay, I've seen all these, tell me something I don't know. So now I'm going to pose a little thing for you to think about at the end of this lecture, okay? So this is something for you to think about. You remember earlier on I was saying that you can make a sphere by taking a disc, something like this, and attaching another disc to it. Okay? Well, a disk, okay, it's a rectangle, but I'm speaking topologically, so a disk is essentially something which has a circular boundary. Okay? So this has one circle as a boundary, because it's a disk. What other shapes have a circle as a boundary? A Mobius band. Okay? So it's difficult to think about it, but this just has a circle as a boundary. It just has one outer edge. Now it's very difficult to actually get this Mobius band so that you can get the circle. I mean, here's a circle on a piece of paper, right? The outside of this, if you follow your finger around the Mobius band, it is basically just a circle. So could you deform this Mobius band so that the circle would be in touch with this? Well, you could try, but you're going to have some problems. It's kind of interesting to try doing that. So the interesting thing I want to leave you with is, what kind of shape do you get if you take this kind of disc here and you stick a Mobius band to this disc? In particular, imagine if you stick this kind of outer edge, this single kind of circle, if you identify that with this circle here missing out of this disc. So it's theoretically possible. It's actually quite hard to do in three-dimensional space, but it's theoretically possible that you can do this and identify all of these points from around the outside of this Mobius strip with all of these points here. What kind of shape does that make? Actually, that makes a very special kind of shape. It's something called the projective plane, and it's actually a really, really important shape for mathematics, and it's also a really interesting shape. So I'd like to think about that.